Okay. How are you? Haramasaika. Everyone, how are you doing? It's a nice day to be alive. Here we are back in Imperator, Rome. And today, we're going to be doing some stuff. Like I said, the plan is to go and invade Kalhu, starting right about now. Let's make sure all our allies will come in. We've avoided the Civil War. We just bribed one dude. And, like, yeah, pretty much that was all we had to do. Kalhu is going to be annoying because they got that other fort right there, which will occupy all of this land immediately. It's a bit awkward. Oh, I do have to talk about stuff today, huh? Yeah, I have to talk about the fucking sea peoples. Um, they've been doing construction outside my window pretty much all day, so I'm probably going to have a clip right after this whenever they start up again. And I'm just going to add in some narration or something in Movie Maker after afterwards, sometime later tonight. But yeah, that'll be fun. I'll be able to talk about history, maybe some politics. I think that's probably what I'm looking to do with these playthroughs. You know, I don't want to keep it stuck to just the game. I want to do something a bit different. Because, you know, this year's been a bit busy in terms of, I guess, memes, really. You know that meme where it's like, like in January it was like coronavirus, and then February it was like getting closer and closer to like war with Iran and stuff like that. And it's like, man, what's gonna happen in May or June or something? And then it's like just a picture of like a asteroid plummeting towards the Earth or something. Like, can't possibly be worse. What could possibly make this year worse? Nothing like that. Hey. Anyway, yeah. No, it'd be interesting just to be able to talk about some stuff. Yeah. Um. Oh, I could also, I guess, talk about my interest in history. Um, what I majored in some of my projects. When it came to history. Yeah, I could do that. I could probably do that in this episode too. Just because a person asked if I could make the episodes a bit longer, and I sort of, yeah, I agree with that. I can make the episodes a bit longer. Sometimes I just feel like I I ramble on a bit, and then I don't want to bother people out of their time. But I mean, when I used to watch a lot of like playthroughs of games, I would often actually just like listen to it as background mute, like, yeah, like background noise or something, you know, when I fall asleep, something like that. Um, I don't know. I'll probably try it out. Do a little bit of something like that pretty soon today. Anyway, that's about all for this little intro to the video. I'm probably going to just to be careful, start doing that, do the narration later bit. Alrighty. Love you all. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples are a part of this whole Bronze Age era, mainly, you know, the late Bronze Age. So quite a while from where we are in the game. And there's a part of it that makes it really interesting. They're a mysterious element to this whole thing, and we don't really know who they were, but we have some ideas. Granted, those ideas are largely based on Egyptian exonyms for them because those are the records we have that survive. But of course, I leave the validity of those findings to the scholars who have far more authority in the subject than I will ever have in my dreams. Yeah, essentially, if you want the Cliff Notes version of it, they're like Bronze Age Mediterranean Vikings. Think of it like that. They're people that are going around and raiding and causing a ruckus, basically. Um, they arrived, in quotation marks, around the 1200s to 1190s BCE, and that quotation mark is something I'm going to talk about pretty soon, which is towards the beginning of the Bronze Age collapse. And that was a span of time of about 50 years in which civilization basically just ended in a lot of places in the Eastern Mediterranean. Um, Scholars used to associate the two together, as though the Sea People's arrival and raiding and plundering of everything around was like the sole cause of the collapse. Now that's met with quite a bit of criticism, because, I mean, there are a lot of climatic conditions that change, droughts, stuff like that, and resource scarcity, all sorts of things might have led to what is hypothesized now as a general systems collapse. If you really want to get into detail about the Bronze Age collapse, I would really recommend the Fall of Civilizations podcast, because they go into it in a lot more detail than I'm able to go to in like a period of a Let's Play or a playthrough of a fucking video game. But essentially, yeah, the Sea Peoples used to be blamed for this whole thing. Now scholars don't really think that's too true. But however, I can't help but think that the Sea Peoples played a major part simply with the trade, issues alone. The Bronze Age system was a huge globalized trade system. Everyone was trading with everyone. Everyone relied on everyone else's resources and materials, and that was how civilization had advanced. So I mean, we consider it now like primitive and minor changes, but at least like contemporarily in comparison to like all the time now we're getting bigger and better computers, but back then those changes in agriculture and in development of metallurgy and all sorts of things like that, those were huge changes, and they all happened as a result of people being able to trade and live in a globalized network of states that were now trading with each other and sharing different resources, and making fuck tons of money. Of course, with Sea Peoples raiding everything, that sort of complicates matters when you're trying to trade with your neighbors. I mean, you're not really going to be able to trade to the same degree if there are fucking Sea Peoples about. But essentially, yeah, there is evidence of droughts and climate changes, like I mentioned, which resulted in, obviously less food. And hey, maybe if one state is, like, used to sending out a whole lot of food to some people, and that food, one way or another, gets to places that may or may not be pre-Sea Peoples, the people that make up the Sea Peoples, and now they're not getting food, you can see how like something like that could cause a whole domino effect that might push people off their land and realize, hey, the only way we're going to survive is if we get out there and start like raiding and pillaging shit. Anyway, the Sea Peoples were a conglomeration of a whole bunch of different peoples, and when I say they arrived earlier, that is to be taken with a grain of salt, because there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that the Egyptians knew who some of these people were beforehand. So, the names of these people, according to the Egyptian sources, are the Denyen, the Ekwesh, the Luka, Peliset, Shekelesh, Sheridan, Teresh, Cheker, and Weshesh. And we have some ideas of who these people may have been. For example, the Peleset have often been theorized to be the biblical Philistines. That may be true because a lot of these Sea Peoples, after they were eventually beaten, did settle down in quite a few places, and the Philistines are recorded to have been there around the 12th century BC, so it's quite likely that they might be the same. And as for the notion that the Egyptians may have known who some of these people were, well, for example, the Sheridan, if you look up on their Wikipedia page, it talks quite a bit about how the Sheridan were recorded, in some records of the Egyptians, sometime around the 14th century BC. So they knew something about some people, and they're theorized to have been the Sardinians. So we have a number of records of battles, specifically mainly between the Egyptians and the Sea Peoples, but we know that when the Sea Peoples started doing their Sea People nonsense, they were coming in and raiding all up and down the Eastern Mediterranean. They're often attributed to at least the destruction of the Hittite Empire. They seem to have damaged the Hittites so permanently that left them open to other people's invasions, and they were originally attributed to the destruction of another kingdom, the kingdom of Ugarit. Except if you look at a presentation called 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, which is based on a book that the person giving the presentation wrote. He's looking at the evidence of this, and some of the people on site that were looking at this said that it looks something more like a rebellion. But in either case, the arrival of the Sea Peoples may have weakened these states so much that they couldn't, defend themselves, and people toppled the old aristocracies. Things like that may have happened. So hey, at least the Sea Peoples were good for something. Just reinforcing this, I'd like to read something about the decline of the Hittites from the Wikipedia page. The Sea Peoples had already begun their push down the Mediterranean coastline, starting from the Aegean and continuing all the way to Canaan, founding the state of Philistia. Taking Cilicia and Cyprus away from the Hittites en route, and cutting off their coveted trade routes. This left the Hittite homelands vulnerable to attack from all directions, and Hattusa was burnt to the ground sometime around 1180 BC, following a continued onslaught from new waves of invaders, the Kaskas, Phrygians, and Bryges. The Hittite kingdom thus vanished from historical records, much of the territory being seized by Assyria. Alongside with these attacks, many internal issues also led to the end of the Hittite kingdom. The end of the kingdom was part of the larger Bronze Age collapse. And now we can get into the Egyptian records. This is what I think is really interesting, not only just because, as a kid growing up learning about stuff like this, I was really interested in big battles and all that cool shit, but this is really interesting when it gets to the Egyptians because it leads to probably some of the earliest beginnings of organized labor. So this is really interesting when looking at it from a perspective of social history. These battles with the Sea Peoples that the Egyptians would eventually win and defeat them and, I guess turn them into land peoples, will cause a series of events that will eventually lead to the first labor strike in history, or at least the earliest one that we know about. So the first real battle against the Sea Peoples proper, between the Egyptians and them, there may have been one before at the Battle of Kadesh, which was a battle between the Egyptians and the Hittites, where the Hittites may have had Sea Peoples as their allies in the battle. But nevertheless, there is one battle led by, on the Egyptian side, a pharaoh named Merneptah, who ruled from 1213 BC to sometime in 1203 BC, and in the 5th year of his rule, he had to fight a battle against the Libyans, who, were allied with the Sea Peoples against him. So, it states in this Athribus Stele, in the garden of Cairo Museum, it states, His Majesty was enraged at their report, like a lion, hearing that the Libyans are attacking with the Sea People, assembled his court and gave a rousing speech. Later he dreamed he saw Ptah handing him a sword and saying, "Take thou it, and banish thou the fearful heart from thee." When the bowmen went forth, says the inscription, Amun was with them as a shield. After 6 hours, the surviving 9 bows, the name of the traditional enemies of the Egyptians, threw down their weapons, abandoned their baggage and dependents, and ran for their lives. Merneptah states that he defeated the invasion, killing 6,000 soldiers and taking 9,000 prisoners. To be sure of the numbers, among other things, he took the male parts of all uncircumcised enemy dead and the hands of all the circumcised. So, that's an interesting way to do a little count of who you took out in that battle, but okay. Now, the one I like the most is the second one, the narrative from Ramses III's reign. And that's because, again, like I said, it leads into this big period in a change in social history where eventually, a while after this battle, there will be, a labor strike, essentially. People will refuse and put down their tools and refuse to work until they get paid. And that all comes as a result of the Egyptian victory here. But let's get into it. So this battle happened sometime around 1178 or 1175 BC. The chronology tends to change quite a bit. But essentially, the first battle is the Battle of Jockey, which happened someplace in southern Lebanon in the 8th year of Ramses III's reign. In this battle, he, like Merneptah had in his battle, led the Egyptians against the Sea Peoples. And they were attacking Egypt, and it was not a good time. The Sea Peoples really seemed to have it in for the Egyptians. They didn't like them at all. The Egyptians had some really fertile land, which might, the Sea Peoples might have wanted to settle down in. But nevertheless, one of the inscriptions says, "The foreign countries, i.e. the Sea Peoples, made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Karchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Pelset, Sheker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, lands united. They laid their hands upon the land as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting. Our plans will succeed." Well, their plans did not succeed. The battle ended with a huge Egyptian victory. We don't, of course, know how many people died, but nevertheless, they were defeated by the pharaoh, and but that wasn't the end of it. There would be another battle happening pretty soon, also known as the Battle of the Nile or the Battle of the Delta, because they were also invading there by sea. So, our thoughts about this Battle of the Delta is one where the Sea Peoples were trying to make an invasion from the sea and land, but Ramses III, I guess, had some ships waiting and ready to ambush the Sea Peoples when they were trying to land their troops, and also had a whole bunch of archers lined up at the delta on the shores, and basically just shot at a whole bunch of Sea Peoples. And typically people back then, when you get shot by an arrow, it seems to be, it's over. Something like that. But basically, the Sea Peoples were also devastated here. And in the inscriptions Ramses III proclaimed, "Those who reached my boundary, their seed is not. Their hearts and their souls are finished forever and ever. As for those who had assembled before them on the sea, the full flame was their front before the harbor mouths, and a wall of metal upon the shore surrounded them. They were dragged, overturned, and laid low upon the beach, slain and made heaps from stern to bow of their galleys, while all their things were cast upon the water." And this battle really put an end to the Sea Peoples fighting the Egyptians. of course, Ramses III would settle a whole bunch of these, sea peoples. Obviously, the Peleset, the Philistines, would be settled down in Canaan. He wouldn't be messing with them anymore. They were there anyway, probably. So, hey, you have new colonists ready to work for you, just as long as you don't chop their heads off or their male parts. That tends to be, you'll be willing to do a whole lot if you aren't going to get your male parts taken away from you without your permission. So basically, yeah, a whole bunch of people would settle down. This has often been shown as like the Sea Peoples being some sort of large period of violent migration waves where, people need to have homes and land, and hey, there's a whole bunch of good land in Egypt that they can take. So the Egyptian victory in this battle was really important. The previous battle, was a big battle that the Egyptians won, but that was at the outskirts of their empire. This sea battle that they had won was something striking. The Sea People's invasion force striking at the Nile Delta was coming straight for their capital. So this was the real one. If you had to choose one to win, this is the one that you need to win. The Sea Peoples can be held off, quite far away, if they're on land, and you can try something there. But if the Sea Peoples make it to Cairo or wherever the capital is, then hey, you're screwed. So because the Egyptians won this battle, they would avoid the destruction that, the Hittites and all the other people met at the hands of the Sea Peoples, but that didn't, guarantee their immortality. Obviously, the new kingdom ended, and only 80 years or so after Ramses III's death. However, a really important period or instance happened because of this battle. The Egyptians were celebrating this victory, and Ramses III was like, hey man, I won this fucking battle. It's time to have a big old parade. And, a whole bunch of the country's resources would go towards funding this grand ceremony. It was, I'll read more about it. So, on ancient.eu, please check it out if you want to read really the first labor strike in history, the article in full. Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson notes, the court now looked forward to the king's 30-year jubilee, determined to stage a celebration worthy of so glorious a monarch. There would be no stinting, no corners cut. Only the most lavish ceremonies would do. It was a fateful decision. Beneath the pomp and circumstance, the Egyptian state had been seriously weakened by its exertions. The military losses of 1178 were still keenly felt. Foreign trade with the Near East had never fully recovered from the Sea People's orgy of destruction. The temple's coffers might be full of copper and myrrh, but their supplies of grain, the staple of the Egyptian economy, were gravely depleted. Against such a background, the Jubilee preparations would prove a serious drain on resources. So, to again put into perspective how devastating the Sea Peoples were, I don't know if I really showed that off, but this celebration was supposed to happen in 1156. 20 years or so after this battle that the Egyptians won. And even still after that, even though it was an Egyptian victory, the trade routes haven't recovered. The grain stores haven't recovered. The Sea Peoples did serious damage to everything around them. And even though the Egyptians won, they still had a lasting effect on them. So the Egyptians continued to focus all of their resources towards this grand, celebration, this grand jubilee, and they're late by several months in paying for the workers, their wages, their grain that they received, and they catch up on it, but then they're late again, and the workers wait for 18 days or so beyond their payday, and then they refuse to wait any longer. According to the article, it says, they lay down their tools and marched towards the city, shouting, "We're hungry!" They first demonstrated at Ramses III's mortuary temple, and then staged a sit-in near the temple of Thutmose III. And the officials had no idea what to do. The entire society was based on this idea of harmony. for example, the pharaoh's job was to maintain harmony between humanity and the gods, for example. And if the Nile didn't do its regular yearly flooding, and crops, declined or something like that, that'd be seen as, hey, the pharaoh's not doing his job, something like that, right? So this idea of harmony, or ma'at, was supposed to apply to everyone, but the peasants weren't having it anymore. The people said, fuck no, and they rose up, and they were demanding their pay. But that's not really the end of it, because Egyptian bureaucracy demanded, essentially, that, this reciprocal relationship where the king was also supposed to make sure that the officials were paying the laborers and giving them their food. The entirety of Egyptian state bureaucracy was based on this notion. And of course, the officials, they were bringing armed guards and stuff to break up these strikes, because the strikers would be in the Valley of the Kings and block off access for people to bring offerings to the dead and stuff like that. And now you have a problem, because the king's supposed to keep the workers safe, and the workers aren't being kept safe from the officials who are supposed to pay them. And now the peasants have something to say, because now it's not just them not doing their job, it's the pharaoh who is breaking this harmony that's supposed to happen, this ma'at. So the workers would strike for months, essentially, and eventually they would get their pay. They would come to an agreement with the officials, and they would get their just payment. However, this would have lasting effects that we wouldn't know about, but we've been striking for quite a while. It was a big realization to the workers and the people then that, hey, workers have more power than they originally thought. If we don't do work, then that brings everything to a halt. We have more power, and we deserve to be treated well. I'd like to read one last quote from the end of the strike, essentially. The strikers said, "We have gone on strike not from hunger, but because we have a serious accusation to make. Bad things have been done in this place of Pharaoh." This is one of the reasons why I think learning about, social history is really important. I mean, learning about military history or something can be cool, and learning about big battles that happened in the past and stuff like that, that might be, cool. That's awesome. That's the big stuff that gets put in the movies. But sometimes social history like this, it has long-lasting implications, where, people find new ways to say, hey, this is, you're not fulfilling your obligations here, and that leads to, big, massive changes. As a result of the military history, the society as a whole changes. That's interesting to me. Anyway, I've managed to ramble on for quite a while about the Sea Peoples and all of this. So please, if you liked it, stick around for the next episode. This is where I'm going to leave this one off. And, hey, have a good day, have a good night, whatever time it is for you. Just live your life. I love you. This has been Kasky. Yeah.